So good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Flesch, and I'm the director of the Mining and Rollo Jameson Museums. And welcome to this final of 7 presentations as part of the 2023 Winter Lyceum. Today is April 2nd, 2023, and I'm broadcasting from Platteville, Wisconsin, home of the world's largest letter M, in the heart of the hilly Driftless area, in a special place known as the Upper Mississippi Valley, lead and zinc mining region where the Badger State was born. Founded in 1965 by the city of Platteville, the museum brings to life a rich cultural heritage rooted in local history, a tradition of science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and a celebration of pioneering, which we recognize to be the living human spirit of ingenuity, inquiry, enterprise, and development. I invite you to stay up to date on museum programs and to support current initiatives online at www.mining.jameson.museum. This year's Winter Lyceum has been a truly electrifying series of presentations on the theme of energy in the context of our driftless area, landscape, and current events. The subject of these talks have ranged from generating and storing electricity in historic mines to solar and wind energy production, to organic farming. This evening, we'll further explore our mining roots and learn about the life for lead miners from northern England, and to consider the source of their energy that drove some to seek out new beginnings in the lead mining region of Wisconsin in the 19th century. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to enjoy a presentation by historian Dr. Kevin Watson titled Not So Easily Led, From Weardale to Wisconsin with the Miners of the North Pennines. I'd like to thank all of you who have registered to participate live today, as well as those who may be watching a recording of this event from our library of virtual programs. Welcome to current friends of the Mining and Rollo Jameson Museum's members and donors, and a big thank you to the sponsors whose financial support has made this program possible. A&W Restaurant of Platteville, Claire Bank, Edward Jones Financial Advisor, Bob Hundhausen, Inspiring Community, Southwest Health, State Farm Agent Jordan Holthouse, and Tricor Insurance. And now, before we begin our program, I'd like to invite you to participate in a question and answer session and a short survey at the end of this evening's presentation. Since we're a large online group, in the interest of time, I invite you to type out your questions as they come to mind and to submit them via that Q&A function you will find at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the talk, our speaker will answer as many questions as he's able to in the order in which they are received. So I'm now pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, who is joining us live from the UK. Dr. Kevin Watson developed an interest in the lead mining hills of the North Pennines in England's Yorkshire County when he was a tour guide at the Killhope Lead Mining Museum in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. As an undergraduate, Kevin visited Wisconsin and developed an interest in mining families who had emigrated from the UK to the US, which eventually became a significant portion of his doctoral thesis and will be the focus of his talk. Kevin has had a varied career that's included time as the director of a museum of primitive Methodism and a lecturer in history at the University of Sheffield. Today, Kevin is head of the Center for Academic Development at Oxford Brookes University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Watson.
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, Oxford Brookes University, the other one, as it's often known. It's so good to be here tonight. The first thing I just wanted to say, first of all, I'm not a great technical expert on lead mining. That might become apparent as we go. But I just kind of wanted to say something about how I got into this subject in the first place. And that is because, as Eric mentioned, I worked at a mining museum as a tour guide a long time ago. The place looks like it's Killhope. It's actually pronounced Killhope, but it sounds like it's going to kill hope, but it's not. And what happened there, I was about to go to Wisconsin as an undergraduate student on an exchange program. And one day a couple came in called Lauren and Arlene Farry, and they were doing this thing of tracing their family tree. And we used to get a lot of queries like this. But I was going to Wisconsin and they said they were from there. And I'm like, oh, I'm going there, you know. And anyway, I asked them, you know, who their family tree included. And Lauren said, well, we were the Watsons and Dents, and we came from a place called Loondale. And I think I kind of went, huh? because on my father's side, we're the Watsons of that valley, and on my mother's side, the Dents. And I told Lauren and Arlene this, and Lauren did that thing that he did quite often, which was he put out his hand and went, cousin. And from that chance meeting, that one afternoon, there sprang not only a great sociable visit to Wisconsin, but actually that visit ultimately led me to a PhD in primitive Methodist history. And I think without that having happened, my career would not have gone in the same path. So I then went on to spend quite a lot of time in Wisconsin, and Lauren and Arlene were among many people who were very hospitable to me. And whenever I think of Wisconsin, I think this is a place of great hospitality, and without that kindness, I would not be where I am today. So on that, I'm really glad to be here, because it's great to be able to share with you. So what I want to do tonight really are three things. First of all, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a virtual tour. Not the same as visiting, so come visit as well. We're going to take a little virtual tour. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the miners' lives were like in the North Pennines. And then from that, we will then get on to, well, why did some of them, and how did some of them decide that basically Wisconsin would be better? So that's the path we're going. So first of all, let's start on a little tour. And you should now be able to see, there we go, a little map of Britain, an outline map. And I'll just take you through where we're going. A lot of people I know in your part of the world, if you're in Wisconsin, when they think of mining, they think of Cornwall. They think of the southwest of England. And there it is. You can see I've got an arrow pointing to it. I went there on holiday last year. Cornwall, famous for tin mining, copper mining, and having Cornish pasties that are almost as good as the ones in Mineral Point. I think I'm allowed to say that because I'm from England, right? But they're almost as good, not quite as good. So that's Cornwall. We're not going there tonight. We're not doing Cornwall. I don't know much about Cornwall. So let's go a little bit further to the north, and on the way up, we'll see Cheltenham Spa. And this is the town where I'm speaking to you from tonight. This is where I live. It's about 50 miles west of Oxford, where I work. And this is a place that was famous in Victorian times, because this is where posh people, rich people came to take the waters when they weren't feeling quite so, so a very posh place. Today, though, famous for horse racing, and actually being the home of GCHQ, which is one of the British intelligence services. So it's basically a spy town, I guess. But that's Cheltenham Spa. So that's about 3 hours drive from the first slide I showed you in Cornwall. And then we're going to go further up, right up another 220 miles or so. And that's when we hit the North Pennines lead mining region. And the Pennine Hills are sometimes referred to as the backbone of England. And we're right at the top of there. If you went much further up, you'd be in Scotland. So that's where we are. And you can see I've got 3 arrows there, but really it's kind of one region. So and you can see some lead mining remains there. We'll come to those as we go. But if I show you a little bit more, I don't know whether you can see my cursor on here when I put it on, but basically what you have is a series of valleys, or they're called dales, and they run from, I guess, east to west. And as you go west, the ground gets hillier, and that's where the lead mines are. That's basically where it is. So right at the top, you would have on the left-hand side map there, you have the valleys of Allendale. And then below that one, the next mining area is Weardale. Then Teesdale's the next one down. And then just right below that, we get into these are in the counties of Durham and Northumberland. But then we get into Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, and the valleys of Swaledale and Wensleydale. And all of these were lead mining towns. So there's quite a lot of them. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm a social historian, really. That's my background, a religious historian, not a technical historian. So it's quite hard for me to try and get a sense of the scale of the lead mines. I found some maps that were showing some, but they don't really show it. But basically, to give you some sense of it, we've got at the top The top bit there, that's the very northern area. That was a very significant lead mining area. But we'll go to the south one first, and just show you this area here. The area I've got highlighted. That's the Yorkshire Dales, and according to the Northern Mine Research Society, there were 218 individual metalliferous mines in the Yorkshire Dales in the 19th century. 218. Now, that doesn't include the northern area, the ones in Allendale and Weardale and Teesdale, which were known to be the largest lead and silver producing ore field in England by the middle of the 19th century. But I don't have numbers on how many mines were there. But to give some sense of the scale, the chief agent of the London Lead Company claimed in 1857 that 9 people out of 10 in Teesdale were connected in some way with lead mining. 9 out of 10. Don't know how he worked that out, but that's about right. So across the whole region, though, we can say that lead mining dates back to Roman times, and that the last peak in mining activity started in the 18th century, was accelerated by technological innovations in the 19th century, and then by the early 20th century, with some very small scale exceptions, it was practically over and gone. And the reason was a lot of cheaper Spanish lead coming in that undercut the market. But what made the scale of it particularly impressive in terms of feats of engineering was that the mineral rights on this land was in relatively few hands. So it didn't tend to be lots of small operations, each doing their own thing, but multiple mines operated by organizations like the London Lead Company or the Blackett Beaumonts, which allowed them to pool resources over lots of mines and take on more speculative operations than would otherwise be the case. And just to give an example of that, that tunnel there is called the Blackett level, and that goes from Allendale town in Allendale up the Allen Valley. That's a tunnel, goes straight into the hill for 4.5 miles. It was meant to be 7.5 miles long, and there were 4 mining shafts connected to it, but they never actually found much in the way of lead ore with it. It just was speculative. They were hoping to hit things, but they never found anything. But that tunnel did have the effect of lowering the water table in the area and allowing some mines in the area to operate longer as a consequence. So it's quite a significant thing, that. Okay, let me now just briefly make the connection between the lead mines in the North Pennines in this country and Wisconsin. In 1850, the English Primitive Methodist magazine started a new regular column, which was titled Emigrant's Corner. And the editor of the magazine prefaced it by writing this. He says, "We are so thoroughly convinced that new countries have been discovered and developed for the benefit of emigrants from overpopulated old countries that we can be no more indifferent to emigration than to brotherly love." So there you go. That's what he wanted to say about emigration. So in an era before people thought so much about data protection and all that sort of thing, people would send to the magazine personal letters that they'd received from relatives overseas, and this national publication would publish them. And one person whose letters appeared regularly in the Primitive Methodist magazine Emigrant's Corner was a chap called John Leakley, originally from Teesdale in the North Pennines, but by 1850, a resident of New Diggins in Wisconsin. And in one letter, he gave a very detailed account of how to get from England to the upper Mississippi lead mining region. He paid particular attention to the best time of year to make the journey, how to avoid swindlers, the dangers of drinking Mississippi River water, and all the rest of it. But it was in a letter to Joseph Greaves that was published that Leakley made his most overt attempt to liken his new home in New England, in New Diggins rather, to the one he left behind in England. And he says this: "We have hills and valleys, what we here call ridges and ravines, and occasionally round hills appear like Kirkcarrion between Loon and Middleton, which we call a moon, and from which a beautiful landscape presents itself, extending as far as the eye can see, And in all his letters, he keeps going on about how similar Wisconsin is to where he's left behind, to Teesdale. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to let you decide for yourselves by showing you the place that he's talking about. So let me just share the screen again and show you Kirk Carrion, which is what he just referred to. This is it. I don't know whether you see a landscape that looks a bit like Wisconsin. Maybe I think I do a little bit. Maybe you don't have so many rock walls like that, dry stone walls, but you know, it's got a similar kind of feel to it in some ways. But let's go further down the valley and see what else we have. So this is Teesdale. And Teesdale today is known as, it's officially designated an area of outstanding natural beauty. So if we go further back down the valley, we'll get to the two castles of Teesdale. So we've got castles, can't have an English talk without some castles, right? We have Raby Castle, which is kind of a sort of 17th or 18th century building, and Barnard Castle, which goes back over 1,000 years. So those are there. I guess that's a little bit different. And then we move up the valley and we find High Force Waterfall, which is a wonderful tourist attraction. But then, like all of these valleys, as we go further west, as we get into the higher ground, that's when the lead mining remains start to appear. And so, for example, right as we get into the upper valley, we get Bell Pit remains. So here's an example of Bell Pit remains, and you can see the diagram there kind of shows how that would work with the windlass taking things up and all the rest. Very kind of primitive form of mining there. But there's also, and I know you've in this series, you've been talking about kind of ecological stuff as well as anything else. You also see some fairly horrendous scarring of the landscape up there. So this hillside here, this is in Swaledale, shows you some hushing activity. And I don't know whether you had things like this, but hushing works in hilly areas. What you would do is you would collect water at the top of a hill, and you would release it in a kind of controlled release down the hill. It would take off all the topsoil, all the plants in there and so on, and it would expose the rock below, and you would sort that for lead ore. You might also use this as a way to find out where it would be worth doing some proper mining into the hill. But you can see, I mean, that hushing there, that's probably 150 years old, and the land is wrecked. That's just what it does. So obviously today we would think that is not an environmentally friendly way to do anything. So let's move on a bit further. This is Killhope Wheel. This is where I used to work. This is where I met Lauren and Arlene all those years ago. And here's a weird thing. I didn't have to look this up. It's 30 years since I worked at this place, but I still know that wheel is 33 feet and 8 inches in diameter. I know it's got the buckets are 6 feet wide, and I know it's got 7,808 rivets holding it together. I remember that instantly. So why I can't remember where my keys are in the morning, I don't know. But there we go. But that's Killhope Wheel. One of the interesting things from a historical point of view and how things have changed, and I don't know whether this is the same in the museum in Platteville, is back in the 60s, this wheel was seen as an eyesore, an absolutely ugly thing, and the local council put out a contract to have it blown up with dynamite to get rid of it. And now, you know, people come and they travel a long way to see this thing, and it's seen as a beautiful piece of industrial, you know, engineering from the Victorian era. Attitudes change, don't they? And sometimes what we see as ugly at one moment is suddenly something we value a little bit later on. So that's Killhope Wheel. And next to Killhope Wheel, the wheel itself was used to operate jigs and various machinery to separate lead ore from other products, from the waste products. Next to the wheel, we have the restored old washing floor which preceded it, and this is where young boys will be employed to kind of have more manual approaches. The things you can see there, it's not a very good photograph, but those are hotching tubs. That's what we call them, and you shake them and the lead ore goes to the bottom, and you scrape off the waste and get the lead ore out. Those are hotching tubs. And then since I left this area all those years ago, a rival museum has emerged over the hill, another lead mining museum in Nent Head. And here are some of the remains from Nent Head. This is a London lead company place. And here we have the company offices you can see there. On the bottom left is the remains of the smelt mill that was there. They didn't have smelt mills with every mine. People would travel because one company operated lots of different mines. You would have a central smelt mill that the lead ore would go to for processing. And you can see that top right picture. That is an old picture from 1979 of the smelt mill chimney, which was a quarter of a mile away or thereabouts from the smelt mill. And it had a kind of horizontal flue that went up the hill, nearly horizontal, slight angle on it, which took the fumes away from the village, not because they were being friendly and environmentally friendly and all that, because they realized that this was a way of making sure that they got every last bit of lead out there, because they'd send people up that flue to scrape the walls and get the last bits out. That's since collapsed. That's an old picture, but this was a kind of common sight of the time. Now let's go just briefly inside a lead mine to see what it looks like. And the first thing you notice in the mines of the North Pennines is the stonework. And one of the things to say about that, there are miles and miles of tunnels under the hills of the North Pennines. And the fascination is, unfortunately, England was very deforested in the 19th century. Unfortunately, it still is. We are the least forested place, nowhere in Europe has less forest than England, unfortunately. So they didn't have access to timber. So their props were dry stone walls. And when I say dry stone walls, you're looking at that tunnel there. There is no cement. Those rocks are being held together just by gravity. And one of the skills that the dalesmen had was this kind of walling technique. And you imagine that this was built somewhere in the 19th century by people with just tallow candles, working this way. It's an extraordinary thing. And you can walk through the tunnels and all that rock work is still there. So that's a kind of typical horse level where the horses would go back and forth, small Dales horses. And here we can see a ladder going up from one level to another. And on the right-hand side there, you see something called stemples, which is this kind of way of going up from a shaft with these precarious kind of little ledges on either side where they didn't always have ladders. And just to give some sense of where this fits, this is a very blurred image I'm going to show you, unfortunately, on the next slide, but it gives you some sense of what we're talking about these mines looking like. So you've got a horse level there. The veins are running nearly vertically. And where possible, what the miners are doing is they're working upwards, because lead ore is heavy. So if possible, use gravity to get it down. So where possible, they're going kind of low in the hill and mining upwards. Of course, they went down as well and pulled up. But that's broadly what lead mining was like in the North Pennines at that time. And in this picture, you can see in the middle there a hopper where the ore is coming down from a higher level. And you can see actually just behind there's an air door. So that's for controlling ventilation. But just to give you some sense, I went down one of these mines in the 90s, and it had sort of around 20 miles of tunnel in it in the one mine. It is the scale of it was quite something. So there's that, and here we can see another horse level. You can see the remains of a tub in there. One of the difficult decisions that they had to make at Killhope, the museum I worked at after I left, when they opened the mine, was they knew that originally this mine had water coming out of the entrance, and that the miners waded to work in a foot of water. And there was a huge debate just before I left, as they were planning this, of, do we make the visitors walk through the water as well? And the answer is, ultimately, because there was a lot of resistance to that, and they wanted concrete floors and all that. And actually, the purists won out. And so if you visit Killhope today, you have to put on some boots and expect to wade through the water. That's what you do. So it was nice to see that. Okay. So that's a little bit in there. And this finally, just the last underground thing I want to show you is this is called the Ballroom Flats. So this is where the lead ore had gone kind of horizontal. And this is an interesting site, because in 1900, huge cavern, in 1900, the Freemasons actually had their annual ball down here. And until the 1960s, the sawdust and bottle tops were still on the floor. So that's quite, I always found that quite interesting. And would make a joke about it being an underground movement, but maybe not. So there you go. That's sort of a quick tour of the mines. And what I want to really focus on for most of this talk, for the rest of this talk, is more about what life was like for miners, and why they left, really. What were the factors that prompted people to leave? And just to get us into that, here's a bleak place. This is the Killhope mine shop. This is actually where I first met Lauren and Arlene Farry, who I mentioned right at the beginning there. And the top right window of that building is where some of the miners who lived too far away from the mines to walk every day, that's where they would stay during the week. So they would walk over Sunday night, work Monday to Friday, and then walk home for the weekend. And these places were pretty bad. This was a kind of normal bedroom size, and we know that this place housed around 32 men and boys in the week. And these were frequently overcrowded and desperately unhealthy. Indeed, a doctor writing a report about mines in the 1842, he said this about the mine shop: though the beds have not been occupied for 3 preceding nights, the smell to me was utterly intolerable. What the place must be in the summer's nights is, happily for those who've never felt it, utterly inconceivable. I should think it no hardship to remain 24 hours in a mine, but I should be terrified at being ordered to be shut up a quarter of an hour in the bedroom of a lodging shop. There is no doubt that the lead mining business was not a healthy one, and that places like that lodging shop could be super spreaders of all kinds of illnesses. The 1842 report I just mentioned shows that the average age at death of the miners in this area varied between 45 and 49 years, depending on which valley you looked at. Respiratory diseases were, of course, the great killer, but that wasn't really understood fully until later in the century. Miners interviewed in 1842 spoke of suffering shortage of breath and bringing up black spit. It was not something particularly complained about, though. People didn't complain about it. It was just accepted as how things were. And a lot of the time, miners were just expected to be grateful for the work that they had. And the question for me is, well, how grateful were they, and how grateful should they be? Well, let me just show you one more interesting thing, one more relic, if you like, from the era. This is a fountain in the town of Middleton in Teesdale, which was a London Lead Company town. And this fountain has a really interesting inscription on it. There's another one at Nent Head, which is the other London Lead Company town. It's one of 2 fountains built in honor of Robert Walton Bainbridge on his retirement as superintendent of the London Lead Company. And the inscription actually tells us it was paid for by the employees of the London Lead Company because they were so grateful for the work that they had. So it wasn't paid by the management. It was the employees saying to their betters, if you like, thanks very much. And I think in some ways, this is symptomatic of what was different between Britain and the United States in the 19th century. Whilst to some extent, at least, the United States was characterized then by qualities of individualism, by that notion that anyone could make it big, you know, the old, you can be born in a log cabin and grow up to be president type of deal. Britain was very different. Britain had a culture of deference that wasn't there to the same extent in America. So if you were a miner and you worked in the North Pennines, then you ought to be grateful that someone was prepared to let you work for not much money in those mines. And companies like the London Lead Company were supposed to be grateful that someone let them work on land which they had mineral rights to. They were supposed to be grateful that the Church of England was giving them spiritual comfort for which they were obliged to give them a portion of their profits. They were obliged to do that. You didn't have a choice in that. You had to hand it over. So the fountain is just one scrap of evidence of the kind of deferential culture in the 19th century that, to a considerable extent, I think, kept ordinary people in their place. We'll see some more as we go on. So there is a question to me then, well, were the miners right to be grateful? How well off were they? Well, in terms of hours that they worked, they were better off than many in some respects. In the 18th century, the average mining day was just 6 hours, rising to 8 hours in the 19th century. Though it's worth noting that most lead miners were also farmers. That was a thing. So farmers might be too grand a word. They often had rented small holdings, which were quite expensive. So areas of land, usually less than 5 acres. So they might have a cow and maybe a few goats or sheep or whatever. They couldn't grow much. The soil on Alston Moor, which is kind of the northern end of all this, where some people tried to farm, was described at the time as, and I quite like this, ungrateful and unprofitable. So, ungrateful and unprofitable soil. There you go. You couldn't grow much. The soil was thin. The wind blew hard. I can remember it was always windy up there. I used to make a terrible joke about it's been so windy today. I've seen a chicken lay the same egg 3 times, It was that kind of windy up there. Not the most hospitable place on earth. But it may be that being tied to the land actually had an effect on people, and it made them less willing to emigrate than might otherwise have been the case. They felt tied to it. In the summer, miners had time off for hay timing and things like this. So it was a kind of dual existence. And maybe being tied to the land and having farming, maybe that meant that sometimes the miners were willing to go through the slump times in the hope that better times are coming. In terms of pay, it will come as no surprise to learn that ordinary lead miners didn't get wealthy, not mining for lead anyway, because the mineral rights and mining operations were in the hands of relatively few people in this deferential society that I'm describing. There was, in their way of working, though, a bit of an illusion of independence, because in some respects, miners could be seen as independent contractors. So men worked in partnership. Usually there's 4 to 8 of them. And every few months, there was a bargain day where a rate was agreed for the work that the men would do. There are actually very few people working for wages. It was all done on this kind of contract basis. So you were paid for what you produced, and partnerships could be paid in a number of different ways. They could be paid by the bing tail, which refers to the amount of ore that they extracted from a mine. So one bing is 0.4 of a ton. The ton tail, that's the other way they could be paid, refers to the amount of lead finally smelted from their product. So that would stop people kind of bringing in too much waste product with it. And then there's the fathom tail, which is basically if you're driving a level into a hillside, you're getting paid by the distance you're driving in. But the bargaining position of miners in these situations was actually pretty limited. If you're working a really rich vein, where it's possible to get quite a lot of ore out really easily, then you got paid less. And you got things like, in his book on lead mining, C.J. Hunt gives an example of someone being offered 20 shillings per bing, unless they get over 15 bings before the 31st of October, in which case 18 shillings a bing. So you're kept down a bit, you're not going to, they won't let you make too much. And miners, of course, had many expenses to bear. They had to pay for the washing of the ore, the separation process. They had to pay for the smelting, for their own tools, for things like blasting powder. So there are accounts of miners buying cheap, damp blasting powder and then drying it out in front of the fire, that sort of thing. So there's quite a lot of expenses. I read another account of a miner who basically thought it was not good to try to come to the surface for anything as trivial as bad air in the mines. So, he wrote, "It's not proper to stop after the candle goes out. Sometimes we must hang the candle half perpendicular, but the grease may flow down to the flame of the candle and burn in spite of the foul air." Well, you don't want to stay down there if the air's gone that bad. So Hunt, in his book, concluded that with all the variables, it was actually pretty impossible to determine how poorly lead miners were paid, but he felt that on average, they did rather less well than the coal miners who lived further east, but they had better housing. Now, more recently, there's a guy called Tim Barmby who's looked in detail at the bargains in Allendale and found that lead miners did at least have the potential for higher fluctuations. So they might actually have a period where they do really quite well, but then it might be followed by one where they did really badly again. But the London Lead Company, I know, had upper limits on what they were prepared to pay miners. They had a kind of standard of like, if a miner earns more than this, it's somehow bad for them. And it's that kind of paternalistic thing. Oh no, they'll spend it on things they shouldn't spend it on, and that kind of thing. So economically, miners were kept in their place with bargains that ensured they never got too high a share of the profits. That committed them to periods several months at a time, working even if the conditions weren't as good as they hoped for, and that frequently forced them to rely on loaned money from the company. Though I will say that there's nothing like the sort of excesses of company stores and all that. When they bought supplies from the company, it tended to be at cost, so they weren't being exploited that way. So the point of me sharing all of that is to suggest that in terms of pay and condition, the lead mines of Victorian Britain weren't the worst place to work. Provided you were able to limit your material expectations and tip your cap to your betters. But some people were not. And William Calvert from Swaledale moved to Benton in Wisconsin in the 1830s, where he farmed and mined and dealt in real estate, and he did quite well. He definitely could not have done the last of those things if he'd stayed in England. Thomas Leakley moved from England and ended up with his own mining business and a smelt mill that he owned with other settlers. He couldn't have done that in England. It would not have been possible. The opportunities for ordinary people to own land or mineral rights were just not there in the same way as they were in America. In his book that some of you will have come across, I think, The Dalesmen of the Mississippi River, David Morris quotes John Alderson, who emigrated from Arkengarthdale and wrote home from New Diggins with these words: "We have no crown, no duty, no bishops, nor yet have I seen a beggar running from door to door, nor anything like an overseer gathering rates. We sit in our humble little cot free of rent. We can turn on the prairie horses or cows free, and by humbly asking leave to mow, we can have as much hay as we please. No gamekeepers. We work as we please. We play when we please. We have no stewards to bow to. One is as independent as another, but we never forget our native land." It's quite an interesting quotation, that, because you see that escape from the deferential culture, and that being a significant part of how new arrivals from England made sense of their move to America. The first attraction was the idea of being materially better off than you had been before. You didn't have to doff the cap. You didn't have to feel controlled by other people. Well, this desire to break free of being controlled by other people was expressed in extraordinarily dramatic terms in 1849, when a rare strike broke out amongst the miners of Allen Heads. The strike might have been averted were it not for the mine agent, Thomas Sopwith, who C.J. Hunt described, I like this, as an able engineer and geologist and an enthusiast for social and educational reform. He mixed these virtues with a heavy Victorian pomposity, an overwhelming belief in the rightness of his actions, and complete inability to see anyone else's point of view. That was Thomas Sopwith. And he decided in the late 1840s that these miners, who saw themselves as independent contractors, should be made, A, to work exactly 8 hours a day, B, that he should tell them which of those 8 hours they should work, what their times in and out should be, and C, he decided that in order to ensure this, he would put agents on the entrances to the mines and check people in and out. And they saw this as a great affront to their independence. And they described this as a spy system. They didn't like it. And a guy called Joseph Heslop on the 21st of March, 1849, took to the pulpit in the local Primitive Methodist Church, and he made this speech. And I'm just going to read you part of it and share it with you on the screen, just to give you a sense of it. It was quite dramatic. He said this: "Now, lads, my orders out of this pulpit to this meeting is that every man has liberty to begin work, But it is my hope and earnest prayer that if any man do begin work in connection with them that has begun, that you will all have the goodness to pass them and their wives and families without speaking to them, to have no connection or communication with them. If they be sick, do not visit them. If they die, do not bury them. If they are fastened underground in the mines, do not assist in seeking them out, but let them die or be killed in the dark, and go from darkness to darkness in the fangs of the devil, to be kept by him without remorse in the fires of hell for all eternity. You are all to torment them while on earth, and when they die, may the devil torment them to all eternity. I won't give you the rest of that, but wow, he was a bit radical, wasn't he? But it is quite a speech. The strike, though, was geographically really limited to a small area. It was one mine, really. It was just one place where this happened, and it lasted around 3 months. And those who participated were not re-employed, and most of them, this is where it gets interesting, chose to emigrate. So maybe we have people here whose ancestors were these radicals, you know. And one of them wrote to the Newcastle Guardian, while America and Australia spread their bosoms to welcome the oppressed, we are ready to brave the perils of the Atlantic or the Pacific. And in a memoir of a life lived in Allen Heads, written half a century later, there is a claim made that about 60 people, men, women, and children, left East Allendale on one day, the 17th of May, 1849, to seek a subsistence on the banks of the Illinois. So there you go. That's where some of them went. Now, it's interesting to me, as a primitive Methodist historian in the past, that strike meeting took place in a primitive Methodist church. You heard at the beginning of this talk that primitive Methodism offered a valuable platform for potential immigrants to explore what their options might be. And in that admittedly unusual example that I just cited, we also heard a primitive Methodist church being used for ordinary people to find their political voice. Methodism was huge in Britain in the 19th century, massive thing, the working class religion, middle class as well to a point, but really an influence on working class people. And for the last 60 years, historians have debated whether it's an example of religion as a tool of social control or a vehicle for liberation. And I tend to think both of those things can be a bit true at the same time. When you consider that the boys who applied for jobs as washer boys, separating the lead ore from the waste product, when they applied for that job aged 12, to get the job at the London Lead Company, you had to pass a Bible test, which is a really interesting thing to have to do to get a job in a lead mine, you know? And it's easy to see a sense of Victorian paternalism in that was keeping people in their place and using religion to do that. The main lead mining companies also provided schools for the children of mining families, and they also provided reading rooms for the miners. And I could cynically comment on how that was also a means of keeping people in their place, for example, by choosing what would make it to the library shelves and what would not. But there is no doubt that education and the religious experiences of mining families was also liberating. And across the northeast of England, there was this huge culture of self-improvement amongst working class, ordinary people, a belief in the value of self-education. I once heard the historian, Methodist historian David Bebbington, tell a story about an educated Church of England curate arriving in Weardale and encountering a miner who was also a Methodist local preacher. And this miner engaged him in a theological debate. And this curate made the mistake of thinking the guy couldn't compete. He's an ordinary miner. And a moment later, this ordinary miner was quoting the German philosopher Hegel at him. And that curate realized he'd made a mistake. So miners were often self-taught, but their education exposed them to a world of possibilities beyond the valleys in which they lived. And the Methodist chapels gave ordinary people experiences of speaking in public and organizing people. So, for example, if you were a Sunday school teacher and you were organizing children in a Sunday school, you could organize a trade union. And a lot of the trade unions in the UK actually emerged from primitive Methodism. If you were a Methodist local preacher, you could then use those skills to address a rally like Joseph Heslop did in that remarkable speech we heard a moment ago. So there was, that kind of radicalism within that as well. So let me start to pull all this together into some kind of conclusion. Hopefully, you'll have seen that whilst by Victorian standards, the North Pennines was not the worst place to be living in England, there was a strong material argument for moving to America in the 19th century. Throughout the time, lead prices fluctuated widely, and so too might the income of miners. So if economic betterment couldn't happen in England, then some thought, well, why not? Let's take a risk on America and see if we can do that. And some people also saw in America the chance to break free from that kind of hierarchical relationships that they lived under, that culture of deference in England. Within this, the idea of land ownership was definitely equated with freedom. But of course, that didn't work out for everyone. There's a letter written by a Yorkshire farmer called John Hodgson on Christmas Day, 1856, and he'd bought land in Wisconsin. And when he got there, it turned out to be swamp, and he couldn't use it for anything. And it's a heartbreaking letter because the last line of it just says, "You cannot tell how bad I want to see someone I have seen before." And it's just heartbreaking. So potential barriers to moving to America in the early years included the hazardous and arduous journey involved. But of course, that improved as the century went on. Whether people decided to go or not go, the decision-making process was facilitated by the literary skills of working class people. That the reason they knew about America was they could read and write, and the people who moved there could. We can't take that for granted. So they wrote these letters and they got published in publications like the Primitive Methodist Journal. They got handed around. There was a massive debate from some folk from Wensleydale at one point about whether it was possible to get a good cup of tea in America. And there literally were letters going back and forth saying, "Can you get good tea?" "Yes, it's the best I ever tasted." "No, it's terrible." And one letter saying, "If I cannot get a good cup of tea in America, I cannot go," this sort of thing. So there was that. But they also knew that when they arrived there would be people in America who could relieve the homesickness that they would inevitably get. And it's worth mentioning that the choice to go to America was never easy. I recall my good friend Steve Calvert in Benton. He once showed me the naturalization papers of his ancestor, William Calvert. And he'd been made in 1848 to sign a paper that said exactly this: "It is bona fide my intention to become a citizen of the United States of North America and to renounce all allegiance to all and every foreign king, prince, potentate, and state, and especially to the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland." And especially. So you had to be especially, not British. That's interesting, isn't it? To move to America was to lose part of your identity. It was a melancholy thing for many people. But the hope was that you would find something new in the process. When it got hard, you had a ready-made English community waiting for you, a community of support, particularly amongst the Primitive Methodists. Knowing that ahead of time might have been part of the appeal. And certainly a central thesis in my PhD was the idea that Primitive Methodism, in its first century in the United States, it doesn't exist in many places. It's only where there are pockets of English emigrants. So a central argument of mine was that Primitive Methodism was institutionally homesick for a century. That's what it was. It was a church for English people. If you missed England, you went to the Primitive Methodist Church, where in 1903, you could hear a talk entitled "Rambles Around Yorkshire." Or 2 years later, more excitingly, they had the English Education Act and Tory tyranny. That sounds like a good one. So you had these people there. They had English teas in Primitive Methodist churches 100 years after the denomination was established there. And it was interesting that last time I was in Wisconsin, which is a long time ago, back in 1999, we did it again. There's a little picture, and you can see in that picture, there's Lauren and Arlene Farrier in there, and they're playing the English role really well with the teacups and the being English. But they did in those days what we did again in 1999. We talked about a home from long ago, but never forgotten, in those northern hills of England. And my time is up, but it's been a real pleasure to do that again tonight, to talk a little bit about those things. It's been really nice to research it. And I thank you for listening. So I will stop there and we will dive, I guess, into some questions.
I love listening to you speak, Kevin. Have you considered being a primitive Methodist minister?
No. The Methodists did try to get me for a while, but no. I did run a Methodist museum for a while, the Anglesey Brook Primitive Methodist Museum, but no, I never did that. I do take services in churches, though. Yeah.
Wonderful. Say, everyone listening, this would be a great time, if you haven't already, to go ahead and type in your question using the Q&A function there at the bottom of your screen. Kevin, let me begin by apologizing. I've mispronounced at least two words so far. So the place name, Weardale, not Weardale. Is that correct?
Weardale, yeah. Weardale.
Good. And
the River Wear.
Killhope, but Killhope.
Yep.
There you go. Thank you for clearing that up. So you touched on this a little bit, but could I please ask, are there any stories that you have of your time when you visited Wisconsin as an undergraduate and afterwards that you haven't shared yet? But what are some of the places where you lived? So who were some of the folks?
Well, I met a lot of people. I mean, Lauren and Arlene were the great people who put up with me a lot. And they had a mean cat, actually. I remember that. In fact, they had a cat that bit a lot, and Lauren would say, "Have you had your English breakfast yet?" And the cat would bite me. I remember that. But I spent a lot of time also with Steve Calvert, and I also remember that Mary Fraymiller at the university, the history room there, was always opening the place when it wasn't really open, so I could get into the archive, which was fabulous. But so many great times. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me was a trip to Pennsylvania to meet a pastor, the Reverend Bill Fudge. And I think he wasn't sure about handing over his archive to me. So I went and I stayed with him for a couple of days, and they took me to a church where they'd hired some actors to come and do the story of Joshua, and basically the King of Jericho didn't show up. And I happened to mention that I'd had some theatrical experiences. It was an improv show, and so basically I suddenly became the King of Jericho and just hammed it up with the English accent and went, get down before me and bow. And this improv guy suddenly went, and the King of Jericho walked around the city walls singing this song. And I had to make up a song. But that event, weirdly, made the pastor go, you know what? You're okay. And the next day he handed over an archive, which allowed me to finish my PhD. But certainly the amount of people that helped me meant that my acknowledgements in the PhD was so long, it was commented on by the examiners. But I had to do that. There were so many people that were so helpful. Amazing.
You mentioned William Calvert from the 1830s, and who immigrated to Benton.
That's right.
Would you mind expanding on that a little bit? Only because you mentioned having stayed with Steve Calvert, and I knew his brother, Bill Calvert, an alumnus of Taliesin, the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. And actually, Bill donated to our museum here before passing away this brass steam whistle from the Calvert mine, his family mine. I'd be curious to know a little bit more of the story you may know of his family.
Yeah, the Calverts are from Swaledale. You can actually a lot of the names that you get in Wisconsin, you can trace it back to particular valleys. And the Calverts, I think they were. It's interesting. In the Methodist hierarchy, they were Methodist Episcopals. It's like the primitive Methodists were the more working class, and we stay there. And the Methodist Episcopals, my tendency was to think of those were the upwardly mobile in society. William Calvert had emigrated in the 1830s initially, I think, and then he went back to Swaledale to get married. and brought his bride back again. So there was a little bit of that went on. That's what I understand from him. But I just found it so fascinating that you had to make that huge sacrifice. And I know that Steve was very interested in the Calverts who were in Weardale. And he said he met people who were Calverts, and he said it was a bit like looking in the mirror at times. It's sort of strange to go and meet people who still were of that line, you know, the ones that didn't emigrate. But he was a great host. We had a lot of laughs, a big help.
One of our attendees thanks you for presenting at what time is it now where you are?
It's nearly midnight.
Amazing.
I didn't go to sleep. Before the end. That's good. That's a bonus. I hope you didn't too.
Yeah. Oh, none of us. No. And Dina asks a question. Have you done any comparative analysis on the wages and living conditions of Wisconsin miners versus their British counterparts? And
I don't know. I don't know, because you'll know more about how they were paid. I've not at all. I know. I mean, I looked at a little bit. I think if you want to find stats on this kind of thing, some of the best sources I've seen are those Labour Bureau statistics annual reports that you get. Some of those are quite racy reads. But I never did that comparison. No, I didn't. But there's a follow-up question about what is the current state of the Primitive Methodist Church in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, I don't know how it is in Wisconsin. It was, I think, that they expanded a few years ago in Wisconsin, and they in America, you have Primitive Methodism in America, in Wisconsin, in the coal mines around Wilkesboro, Pennsylvania, in that area, and you also have some in New England. But they also then expanded and had more kind of Spanish-speaking ones in Florida later on. In the UK, Primitive Methodism has not existed since 1933, when Primitive Methodism and Wesleyan Method, basically most of the Methodisms got together and formed the Methodist Church, which exists to this day.
Robert Humphreys, who lives in Spring Green, himself originally from Wales, says, thanks for the great discussion. He says, I recognize a lot of similarities with Welsh immigrant experience in the Wisconsin lead mining district.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you want to read a good book generally about this sort of thing, there's a book by David Hackett Fisher called Albion Seed, and it does this thing which I think is really interesting, where he draws a map and draws lines, you know, different of where different immigrants went. So you get food ways and marriage ways and all these different ways we express our identity. I always find it fascinating. I made that little joke at the beginning about how the Cornish pasties in Mineral Point were better than the ones in Cornwall. But there's some truth in it. And the truth is, foodways are one of the ways in which immigrants in America recreated their home. So the food became more important than it had been before. So you kind of perfect it, and you put better steak in, and you do all that. And it becomes more of a ritual, if that makes sense. So I think you see parallels in lots of different ethnic groups, but absolutely in the Welsh had lots of mining areas. I'm quite near Wales, here where I am today. So yeah.
Well, what would be some of the culinary traditions that those from Yorkshire may have brought to Wisconsin? Is it
Yorkshire pudding, English tea, Yorkshire pudding, which which my mother, who was a great caterer. My father was a Methodist minister for many years, and they did an exchange, and they went to Wyoming. And my mother came up with a crazy idea of giving some Wyoming people an English roast Sunday dinner. And she tried to make Yorkshire puddings in Wyoming, but guess what? The altitude means they don't rise. It was her only disaster ever in cooking. The Yorkshire pudding does not rise in Wyoming. But there we go. Tatty cake. There's tatty cake, potato cakes, tatty cakes. Aye. Of course, you'd have scones. Scones would be good, wouldn't they? And you have your tea, obviously. Got mine here, gone cold. I think those things do become important, though, and you see these English teas, and I can remember in the Primitive Methodist Church in the 90s in Pennsylvania, talking to a minister who was still embarrassed because people wanted to keep the tradition going of the pasty night, and he saw it as too English.
Really?
And that it might not, yeah, that it might limit their appeal to have these English traditions. And this is so long after, but there were these kind of English influences there, yeah, a long time after. I mean, there's theories about immigration, and I think one of the things that my PhD did for me was it made me think really hard about what's involved in any emigrant experience. And one of the theories about that is this, that actually, if you're migrating from one country to another, it actually takes 3 generations to settle. So the first, if you look at American 19th century, you get the first generation never get over the homesickness. They might do well, but they're homesick. Their children often seeing how things have been for their parents become what we might term hyper Americans. So, you know, we get people like the Reverend John A. Cornley writing books, and he's, you know, called a Primitive Methodist, Uncle Sam's Enemies and How to Whip Them. And it's quite bad what he says, you know, but they're hyper Americans, and they'll say, we're not hyphenated. And only the grandchildren then get to that stage of, well, you know, we can draw from both cultures, and that's useful. But I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about when we look at modern immigration as well, that kind of notion of it's not an easy decision. And when you leave a culture behind, you are losing part of yourself. So yeah. And we had a question about going to Jenkinsville Church. I did go to Jenkinsville Church. Yeah, I did. Thank you. It's a long time ago, though. We went to a lot of churches in my time there.
Thank you, Sharon Carnes, for your question, asking if Kevin had visited this historic church near Benton. It sounds like you have, Kevin.
Yeah.
So what would the fact that the geology in the North Pennines was similar to that of Wisconsin's driftless area, do you think that influenced the fact that they were such great stonemasons and
oh yeah,
familiar with the barrel vaulting technique, and they bring that to southwestern Wisconsin?
I think that's right. I mean, you can see some of that stonework around, can't you? And in fact, a lot of my relatives are still dry stone wallers in the Yorkshire Dales. I'm not. I'm not practical at all, but it is an absolute skill, and I think it was probably needed, wasn't it? So, do you have similar kind of tunneling, or do you see that sort of thing?
Well, that's a great question. We see lots of stone architecture. You know, you had mentioned that the hills have become denuded there in England, and similarly here, either because of cutting down trees for firewood or using it for mine timber or smelter fuel. There was not an abundance of trees necessarily, and it may have been considered, you know, either because it wasn't available or too expensive, or just a faux pas to use wood to build with. Instead, a lot of the commercial and residential architecture here is made of the local stone, and they have different character depending on where the stonemason was from. But in certain key areas, there's a local historian, Tracy Roberts, who has studied I
know Tracy. I remember Tracy. Yes.
not some of the early badger huts that use that barrel vaulting technique, and then also. Actually, they're in Mineral Point nearby here. They're doing some tearing up of the local street for the first time in many years, and discovering some of this set barrel vaults of the kind that you showed.
Oh wow!
Underneath a busy intersection that's probably been there since the mid 19th century. So yeah, there is evidence of that.
It's quite a skill, isn't it? Yeah.
You know, Mary Kritz asks, was there much return migration?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think there was lots. I think that got easier later, but the hassle of up to the kind of 1850s of going back again was extreme, you know. But I mentioned William Calvert did go back to find a wife, so there was a little bit of that, but it's an admission of failure as well, isn't it? So I don't see lots of it, if I'm honest. I think later on, that became much more common. So by the 1870s, 1880s, you do get people going backwards and forwards more. But I think in the earlier period, it's a big life decision, and it's quite hard to undo. You spend all your money getting to America. And it's a horrible journey. Not only you've got the journey across the sea and all the rest of it, you've got to walk from the Dales down to Liverpool, which is it's a long way. And then you have to wait around for 2 weeks, maybe waiting for a ship. If you kind of want to get a sense of what it was like, the old David Morris book, The Dalesman of the Mississippi River, does that very well. The whole book is just about the journey. That's what he does, and it's a nice little book.
That hadn't been on my radar before, but you really piqued my interest in that David Morris book. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
I'm looking for it. I think I had there it is. You see, I had some books. That's what it looks like, folks.
Oh, look at that.
Just a little book, but it's a nice book done in 1989. So you can get it on the internet. There's lots of, yeah.
Okay, we'll be looking for that one. Well, Kevin, I feel like we could chat with you for hours. In a way, that was the first time we've ever met. You seem like an old friend, a family friend, and we'd sure love to have you spend some time with our museum audience again someday, whether here in person or perhaps virtually, if you might be willing to do that.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great, and I know over the years we've had quite a lot of people come visit from Wisconsin. So if anyone's doing the family tree, then do let me know. It would be. I've enjoyed being a tour guide, having enjoyed so much hospitality from people in Wisconsin in the past. So it'd be always nice to meet people.
Well, isn't that wonderful? That would be definitely a dream trip for many of us. And so couldn't it be more honored. Again, thank you so much for spending time with us, Kevin.
Thank you.
So great to meet you. Thanks to all of you who participated in tonight's talk and who participated in the Winter Lyceum as a season ticket holder. And so to all, thank you and good night. Bye, Kevin.
Take care.